Hello and welcome back to CamBro Conversations. Today's conversation, I'm lucky to be joined by Cynthia Thurlow. Cynthia, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I've been looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. And there's so many different areas that we can go with this, but traditionally we always like to start from the start. But the start point that I'm most interested in your life, Cynthia, is your start in medicine and how you started to pursue a career within that space.
It's a great question. It's funny. I went to undergrad and got a degree in international studies and was pre-law. So I applied to law school, was accepted, and then it dawned on me that I didn't actually want to be an attorney. And so I spent a couple of years working for a Fortune 500 company. And ironically enough, I got a dog. I always wanted a dog, and getting a dog really encouraged me to really pursue what I was most interested in, which was medicine. And so I went back to school and took 2 years of pre-med classes and then applied to a combined program at Johns Hopkins, which is a big, medical institution on the East Coast. I had a really strong interest in HIV and AIDS research. And at that time, that was really at the peak of the HIV and AIDS crisis. And so that was a really great place to be. But what I came to find out was as much as I loved treating those types of patients, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. And so it was a natural inclination to kind of then pivot and, lean towards ER medicine and cardiology. And so that's where I spent a lot of the last 20 years. And that's kind of where that interest stemmed from. And I'm so glad that I never went to law school because none of my friends that are attorneys are happy. And I always feel like that was a great kind of serendipitous way to kind of pivot and end up in a career path that was much better aligned with my interests and my needs.
Certainly. What drove the initial interest in HIV and AIDS? Was it just because it was so topical at that point?
Well, it's interesting. So back in like the mid 1990s or, late 1990s, that's still at a time when there was emerging research and emerging technology in terms of, looking at HIV and treating it. And I worked as a volunteer at an HIV and AIDS clinic in Washington, D.C. And so that's where that initially stemmed from. And very different population that was impacted in Washington, D.C. versus Baltimore. Washington, D.C. was mostly gay men. And then inner city Baltimore was impacted much younger people, mostly IV drug abusing. And there were so many social issues that went along with that. And being a suburban girl my entire life, I had not really been exposed to that. It was an enormous intellectual jolt. There were a lot of patients that were as young as I was in my 20s. And so for me, it was incredibly valuable, the time that I spent, caring for HIV and AIDS patients as a student in Baltimore. But I realized that my talents and my perspective, I just like the adrenaline junkie stuff. Give me a really sick, traumatic patient or someone that's barely clinging to life. And that lit me up at that time in my life. So that was a major pivot, but I'm grateful for the opportunities I had, years ago, because it really leaves an indelible impression. Every patient you take care of definitely leaves an indelible impression.
Of course. I'm interested, this move into the more adrenaline side of things, the ER. What kind of things were you dealing with there? You mentioned cardiac, for example, but what was the range of patients that were coming in?
Yeah. So working in the ER, we saw, traumatic injuries, medically complex patients. We were a level 1 trauma center. So there was just a lot, like the sickest of the sick ended up in most of the hospitals I worked at. But what I was most interested in was anything related to the heart. So if you had someone that had a heart attack, cardiogenic shock, someone that was just, clinging to life because they had a dissecting aneurysm, I just found everything about the heart utterly fascinating. And so that was a natural extension. I still got to deal with very sick, medically complex people. But, when you focus in on like one organ system and the heart really impacts every body system, it's just endlessly interesting. Whereas a lot of people will gravitate away from cardiology, it tends to attract a very particular personality. Most of the people that gravitate towards cardiology are a little bossy. I'm quietly bossy. But you have to be assertive. Otherwise, you can't manage, really critically sick patients effectively. You have to be able to, be the captain of the ship, if you will, if you're managing a code or managing a sick circumstance or flying in a chopper to move someone. So I still to this day, everything about the heart still fascinates me. I don't think that's going to be a lifelong interest, of course.
I think from our discussion already, I'm noticing that you have quite a high level of self-awareness though, because you identified quite quickly you didn't want to be in the law space. You identified quite quickly that I need to move from the more day-to-day mundane treatment of the HIV patients all the way through to the more adrenaline, which was the term you used, adrenaline junkie. So you had good awareness there. Did you have quite good levels of self-awareness at a young age? You've even called it like you're quietly bossy, for example. When did you start to frame these things in your mind, and how did you channel that?
Well, I think that's an incredibly insightful comment. I grew up with parents that were divorced, and the only way I could navigate a very traumatic childhood was to gauge my where I was in time and space, gauging other people's personalities, their moods, because I had a very abusive father. And so a lot of my childhood, and I was told I was a very quiet child, and it was because I was just taking in information. So I've learned, and part of my survival mechanisms in early, childhood, mid-childhood, and early adulthood was just really mitigated on paying attention to what was around me and being very aware of how I felt. And so I was probably a bit more emotionally evolved than a lot of my peers, because that was the only way that I could kind of mitigate and manage, being a successful human amongst what I grew up in. And it's only now, to be completely fair and honest and transparent, that it's only now at this stage in my life, I realized I was a trauma survivor, because I think in many ways, especially certainly with my training, a trauma is a trauma. It's a rape, it's a murder, it's something grandiose. And I think now there's a lot of emerging research suggesting that you can have micro traumas throughout your lifetime, and your response to them, how you evolve as a human being, probably sets you up with one extreme or the other. Either you develop some really substantial coping mechanisms, which is what I did, or you have people that end up, there are a lot of different ways you can end up, but a lot of what I see is people end up with addictions, whether it's to substance abuse or alcohol. And so growing up with an alcoholic parent, there was no way that was going to happen for me. So it's only now that I really understand and appreciate how my body coped, or how I chose to cope with what I went around, what I grew up around. So I find that incredibly insightful that you realize that about my personality. But I will pivot. I am definitely a pivoter. I'm someone that has no problems changing course and going like the opposite direction from most of my peers, because I acknowledge that's probably what saved me as a child, was being able to do that.
And I think you have to be quite emotionally mature or reckless, one of the two, to make those pivots. And it sounds like the way that you're verbalizing it now and you're reflecting, of course, we have hindsight, but at the time it's clear that you were using some of these terms and language within yourself to make these big decisions, which have led to the change in path, which is away from your peer group and more towards what you would maybe call like a more purposeful choice. For example,
yes,
working within medicine versus law, working within ER and high-paced environment versus a more mundane environment. It's clear that the self-talk that you've got at a very young age is directing you, even if it's only now that you're maybe able to verbalize it so eloquently and clearly to an audience of people to understand why you are the way you are.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I think the other thing is there are those of us that are lifelong learners. They're just curious. And I will be that way till the day I die. So I'm constantly, I like being intellectually challenged, which is why I made some of the decisions that I made. And so, it's interesting. It's sometimes not until someone else provides reflection for yourself that you realize you're like, oh yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. Maybe at the time it didn't, but that's been a large part of my adult kind of maturation and evolution, is that I acknowledge that intellectual stimulation is really important to me. I'll give you one example. When I left that cardiology group that I had been a part of for 12 years, it was very challenging, because they were offering me everything you can imagine to keep me. Do you want to change in schedule? Can we make things easier, less of a call schedule? And I just said, this isn't you. This is me. This is me needing to grow. And intellectually, I've learned all the things I can, and now I need to do something else. But I acknowledge that for a lot of people, that's not a possibility. So I sit in complete gratitude that I had the ability, the luxury, quite honestly, to be able to do that, because not a lot of other people do.
Yeah, undoubtedly. And again, that's like a reflection, but at the time, these thoughts were going through your head and you've taken action on them. So 12 years down the line into this slightly more exciting career. You've got a level of fulfillment from it, but where do you go from there, and what were the drivers in moving on?
Yeah, well, this is a great, probably more interesting story. So almost 6 years ago, I could tell that I was really struggling at work, that intellectually I was going through the motions, going through the paces, taking care of my patients in the hospital and the clinic. But I was much more interested in talking to people about lifestyle medicine. I was much more interested in digging deeper into, the foods people chose to eat and the impact on their health. And so almost 6 years ago to the day, I woke up one morning and told my husband I couldn't write another prescription. I was like, I can't admit another patient. I can't write another prescription. I had no business plan. I just had the blind faith that I would be successful. And so I literally 6 weeks later left a job I had done I'd been with that group for 12 years. I'd been with another hospital system 4 years. So I'd been in that role for 16 years and leaped and became an entrepreneur. Like I said, I didn't have a business plan. I had no clear-cut idea of what I was doing. I just fervently believed I would be successful. And it's not naivete. I think it was like, just like turning again, taking the path less traveled, because a lot of my peers thought I was crazy. Obviously now retrospectively, it was one of the best decisions I could have ever made. But I almost instantly started attracting a particular type of patient, that was looking to get answers for symptoms they were experiencing. And so from there, I developed one-on-one programs and group programs, and then started doing some public speaking. And the universe has definitely validated that was the right decision. Might not have been the right decision for a lot of other people. And I look at it now and I kind of laugh. I'm like, wow, that was like a massive calculated risk. And my not poor husband, he's a wonderful guy, but he is trained as an engineer. He's a finance guy. He completely freaked out and lost his mind. He's like, what do you mean you're leaving a well-paying job to go do a job you're not going to get paid for a long time? And so I have to give him credit for giving me the opportunity to be able to do that. But yeah, I'm an entrepreneur now. I still get to use the same medical background, but I get to impact people in a very different way.
When you woke up and said, I'm not going to write another prescription, that was some sort of event that came off a series of back of events, I would imagine, rather than maybe you had a bad day the day before and you said, I'm out. What were some of the things that compounded over time that drove that?
Well, I think it started with, I had a lifestyle that was hard to maintain, meaning I had a husband who did a lot of international travel. I obviously had a demanding job. I had 2 young kids. I was probably not sleeping enough. I was probably over exercising, not purposefully. It's just what you can get away with in your 20s and 30s. You can't necessarily get away with the same degree of stress, especially if you're a woman. And so I just got to a point, I was like, I'm exhausted, and there has to be a better way to do this. I have to be able to impact just as many people, if not more, and do it in a way that I can. This is where my feistiness comes out. I was like, I have to be able to do this in a way where I have more control over my time. Because when you work in medicine, I mean, you're up very early, you're home very late, and the expectations are huge. You have a lot of pressure. And I'm not suggesting there are other fields or other occupations that don't have the same degree of pressure, but I think having a quality of life is certainly very important. I would be the first person to say that quality of life is the most important thing, more so than just about anything else. I think that I lived at the time in a part of the United States that was very affluent, and I was getting increasingly concerned that my kids were growing up in an environment that wasn't particularly realistic. And I said, what are they going to do when they go off to college? They're going to think everyone lives like this. And so I think there were a lot of different variables that impacted me at that time. But I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that I felt like I could make a larger impact being outside of a clinic, outside of a hospital, and be able to help more people and still be of service to others, but do it in a different and unique way. But I do agree with you that a lot of the other factors that I was dealing with were absolutely pivotal in that decision. But I literally just got up one morning and said, I'm done. And that was when my husband just about fell out of bed. He was like, what's going on? Because it's so unlike me. I tend to be someone that once I commit to doing something, I will follow through. And to abruptly, although I gave my employer plenty of notice, more than I needed to, it just wasn't, I was not doing what the average person would have done, because I think many people they work in an industry for a certain amount of time, it's easier to stay than it is to leave. And if you look at the trajectory of my life, I've pretty continuously picked, a direction that most of my peers did not. And there's no criticism for people that need the safety and security of not pivoting away, but that's just not aligned with my personality.
16 years was a good commitment though to a particular space. And for you to move on, you were still practicing within that space, just under your own umbrella rather than within the constrictions of the system.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because in the state I'm in, we can practice autonomously. And so at the time, technically, we were not able to. So I had a couple years where I was just talking to people about food and I was getting very well paid for it and the lifestyle piece. And then when we were given the opportunity to become fully autonomous, I, updated my license so that I could have that distinction. And I probably have written 10 prescriptions over the past 6 years. I just have no desire to go back down that path. I always say that I play well with others. So if a patient ends up in my practice and they need things like that, I have resources that I can, other healthcare providers that are more focused on those kinds of modalities. And so to me, it's been really kind of exciting and fulfilling to see the kind of burgeoning field of integrative medicine, functional medicine, and how in many ways it's filling in the gaps for chronic and preventative disease management here in the States. I know our healthcare system here is really broken. And so I know a lot of other countries do a much better job. Here in the United States, it's essentially a sick care system. We wait until you get sick and then we deal with your issues, as opposed to being more proactive and spending time talking to patients about the lifestyle medicine, which is the most important contributor to health and longevity. We don't talk about that. Or if you do, you end up paying out of pocket for it. So it's a system that's really fraught with good intentioned, well-meaning healthcare professionals, but the system itself is broken.
Yeah, I think although in the UK we have this fabled NHS, which is free at the point of service, which is very important and very valuable to people of all creeds and colors and incomes and backgrounds, which is fantastic. And that differs greatly to what happens in the States. However, it is very much a sick care model as well, where it's very reactive rather than proactive. And the kind of people that listen to a podcast about self-development are very interested in being as proactive as possible. And one of the terms you used in that discussion there was gaps. And you feel that integrated medicine and functional medicine plugs some of the gaps within the traditional healthcare system. What were some of the glaring gaps that you identified in your kind of medical career up until that point?
Yeah, and I want to backtrack and just make sure I acknowledge that here in the United States, at least, urgent and emergent care is superlative. I mean, we have some of the best technology in the world. What we don't do a great job with is prevention. And we certainly don't do a great job with chronic disease management. And so the kinds of things that I see really missing is we do a terrible job with diabetes. I can't tell you how many people end up in my practice and I look at their labs and I'm like, diabetes is a long game. 10 years before this particular lab was abnormal, you had diabetes, but no one diagnosed it. So I think we do a really terrible job with early preventative diagnosis for metabolic disorders, insulin resistance, diabetes, infertility, polycystic ovarian syndrome, high blood pressure, et cetera. And we do a terrible job once people have the disease, because what do we do with our diabetic patients? We tell them to eat heart healthy grains, count their carbs, take more insulin if they've eaten too many carbs, and then send them on their merry way. So I think if we look at a lot of the chronic preventable disease states in westernized countries, they're really disease states of insulin resistance. And, I've had the opportunity to connect with, like a preeminent insulin researcher who I've had on my podcast a couple of times. And he has really influenced my thought process about metabolic health. And, from my perspective, I think that's what I was probably leaning towards years ago, but didn't really realize. So the other things that kind of traditional allopathic medicine doesn't do a great job is really talking to patients about the stuff that matters the most, the hard stuff, not prescribing medication. It's talking about stress management and sleep quality and, anti-inflammatory nutrition and the right kind of exercise. And I think that, if we were having those conversations at a younger age, even if maybe someone who was 20, 25, or 30 wasn't interested in it yet, they would understand the net impact of their choices. And so, from my perspective, I'd much rather talk about the hard stuff, because it's easy to take a pill. It is not easy to change the way that you live your life. And I think that's where a lot of patients are missing, or providers rather, are really missing opportunities to impact their patients' lives. Because if we solely focus on prescription medications, we are missing opportunities with our patients. And that's something I feel fervently.
Lifestyle is a much harder thing to change, isn't it? Because if you write the prescription, as you said, that's an immediate easing of the patient's mind, because they're like, if I take this, things will improve, I'll deal with this condition. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, some of the conditions that you round off there are years in the making in terms of lifestyle choices, particularly driven by maybe like obesity, a sedentary lifestyle, whatever else is going on that's led to them being at much more severe risk of suffering from some of those conditions. And to not address what has driven that, and to put what I would call like a sticking plaster over a gaping wound, is pretty irresponsible. And no wonder that the spend on medical bills are higher than ever before, just based on the fact that if we don't address these problems, people will keep coming back either with other conditions or greater severity for their existing conditions. So I find that refreshing, that there's that drive for you to, I'll have the hard conversation. I will tell somebody that unfortunately your lifestyle is not conducive to health in the short term or the long term, and you need to make change. And some people don't want to hear that. And we're talking about pills. That would be a bitter pill to swallow, to say to somebody, well, listen, the way that you've lived for the last 15 years has put you directly in this situation you are in just now. And I guess that leads me on to like looking at solutions, because we've talked about this problem. It sits there, it's growing, it's awful, it's terrible. But what are some of the immediate areas that you look to address with people, Cynthia?
Well, I mean, one of the easiest things to start with is just meal frequency. Here in the United States, it's not at all uncommon for people to have 3 meals a day and snacks. And I've traveled enough internationally to know this is also a problem shared by a lot of other countries. And so when we talk about meal frequency, it's the understanding that when we eat frequently, we are constantly interacting with specific types of hormones that are not bad, but they get a bad rap. Specifically, when we eat in response to food consumption and whatever types of food we've consumed, our blood sugar will go up in response, and then our body will secrete insulin, and insulin will, if it's functioning properly, will move the blood sugar into the cells, and that's supposed to maintain homeostasis. But over time, if we just eat relentlessly, or we're eating every 2 to 3 hours, we're never really giving our bodies an opportunity to have any digestive rest, get that insulin level back down. And what ends up happening, and this is why insulin unfortunately gets a bad rap, insulin is designed to be a fat storage hormone. And I remind people that if your insulin levels remain high over time, you're not going to be able to tap into fat stores for energy. In fact, you're just going to continue to gain weight and gain fat. And so it's really important for people to understand that if we want to manage or mitigate changes in body composition, lose weight, et cetera, you have to master insulin. And then one of the ways to master insulin is to eat less frequently. I know sometimes people don't like to hear the word fasting because they find it triggering, but it is what it is. But another way to say it is to eat less often. And so I've come to find out that even if a male or a female does nothing more than change the window in which time frame in which they eat, they can have a huge net impact on their health. And I've had people who've gone from eating a standard American diet, eating 12 times a day, to eating 2 or 3 times a day, even still eating the crappy diet, and they will go on to change body composition and lose weight. Now, over time, ideally, I want them to change the crappy food they're eating too, but I always say it's like one step at a time. But eating less frequently is a really great step. And the other piece of that is, the health and wellness industry is, billions, if not trillions of dollars a year. And so I remind people that with fasting, it pretty much can be a pretty free and flexible opportunity to capitalize on a strategy that you can do throughout your lifetime in most instances.
And when did you start to come across this approach? Is it something that you employed personally for your health or for patients? What was the entry to this?
Yeah, no, it was me. I always say the N of one. So I, early 40s, had never had a weight problem. Had always been super, thin and lean. And all of a sudden it was as if overnight, all of a sudden I like couldn't sleep and I gained weight. And when you're 5'3", you know, gain 10 pounds, that's a lot when you're a petite person. And so for me, it was initially out of curiosity to see if this would be the thing that could help me, you know, get my health back. And so the irony is it was so effective for me on so many levels. I mean, the mental clarity alone is what kept me very aligned with intermittent fasting, because I was like, heck, I feel like I can do anything. I have so much energy, I could do anything. And so, you know, it started off with just me, and then it started to kind of bleed into the work that I was doing with other women, both on a group level and a personal level. And then obviously it gave me an opportunity to do a talk in 2019, which changed everything. And that decision to pick that topic, because I had done another TEDx talk, was as easy as saying to my husband, what do I know a lot about? He was like, oh, intermittent fasting. I was like, okay, we're going to talk about intermittent fasting. And that's as much as I thought about it. So, you know, it started out probably 2015, 2016 timeframe. So, you know, I've been actively doing this over the last 5 or 6 years. And I truly believe that this is one of the reasons why I look and feel pretty darn good for, you know, for any woman, but I feel like it's given me an opportunity to stand on a platform to encourage others, not just women, but also men, to use this strategy, consider this strategy as something they can do throughout their lifetime.
Yeah, I spoke to a guest called Kayla Barnes, who's a longevity expert, and she held up intermittent fasting as one of the key tools in longevity. And that probably speaks there to how you phrased that in terms of looking, feeling, for like as a woman of your age, extremely fit and healthy and youthful and vibrant, which are all terms which have positive connotations if we think about how we want to look and feel. So I can certainly understand it from that perspective. And when I've heard you speak before, I've heard you talk about the unhealthy truth. When did you come across this, and what role did it play for you?
Yeah, it's probably the book that changed my life. And last year I was really honored to be able to bring that author, Robin O'Brien, on my podcast. So I have my oldest child who's now 16, which is hard to believe. But when he was 4 months old, yeah, it goes by that quickly. When he was 4 months old, he developed horrible eczema. And as a new parent, you know, I bring him into the pediatrician, and all the pediatrician kept recommending was to give him topical steroids to decrease the inflammation. And sure enough, they work. But I kept saying, well, is it something I'm eating? Because he was being breastfed. I was like, is it something I'm eating, something I'm doing? Because of course, moms always have mom guilt. And so when I had that conversation and I was told, oh no, you're fine. But that didn't satisfy me. I had to go down the rabbit hole of really looking at the interrelationship between gut health and skin issues. And so it became apparent to me that he probably had a food allergy, although I did not expect him to have the allergies he had. And so after a lot of like pleading, because no one wants to test food allergies on an infant or even a toddler, we ultimately found out my oldest son had life-threatening food allergies to peanuts and tree nuts. And so I spent about 2 years after that being paranoid to take him anywhere, because the allergist's lasting words to me were carry an EpiPen and pray, that didn't sit really well with me. Having my ER background, I know what anaphylactic shock looks like, and it's not pretty. And so I started making all of his food, which was wonderfully labor intensive and just garnered greater awareness. And around that time, I read Robin's book, The Unhealthy Truth. And it made me so angry when I read this book, when I started to realize the influence of big ag and, you know, here in the United States, USDA, and all the influences of private interests and how that has impacted public policy here in the United States, and just made me mad, because I realized that my child probably would not have had some of these health issues if we didn't grow food the way that we do here in the US. And so that book got me down a rabbit hole. I initially thought maybe I wanted to do a PhD. And so I started a program doing that. I hated it. And then I did a wellness coaching program. And then I stumbled upon another book called Eat the Yolks. And it was completely contrary to anything I'd ever read about nutrition. And so I reached out to the author and just said, I loved your book. I'd love to hear more about, you know, where you did your training. And so sure enough, that's what lit me up. So I think preemptively, prior to ever thinking about leaving clinical medicine, when I started that functional nutrition program, that changed everything for me. It opened up a whole other world of looking at food, not defensively, but proactively. And so I always credit the unhealthy truth for moving me outside my comfort zone, because I'm someone that believes fervently that we can't be dogmatic. We need to be open-minded. And had I not been open-minded, I would have missed that message. And I always credit that book with getting me to where I am. It may not have made sense at the time, but it certainly retrospectively made sense, because it got me thinking. Like, I was trained at a university that really encouraged us to think critically. And I was raised with parents that, despite having not having a very healthy relationship, they encouraged me to be, very intellectually curious. And so that ultimately is one of the reasons where I am today. And actually, when I interviewed Robin O'Brien, it was a little bit emotional for me, although I tried to not fan geek too much, because I told her, I said, you've really changed my life in such a wonderful way, because I don't know if I would have moved or pivoted as sharply as I did had I not read that book. And this is why I encourage people to read a lot. Reading is important, because you never know what you're going to get exposed to.
I think when we take a bird's eye view of that story, the different elements of it, where you've got this content that's helped shape your outlook, as well as your personal experience with your son and your own health and well-being, the importance of what you put into your body in terms of the timing and the systems that you have, but also the quality of that food, as well as where it comes from and the sources and all that kind of stuff. It's very interesting how that's all kind of combined together to put you on the path that you're on when it comes to helping other people enjoy the benefits of that. And it's straight away, of course, there's an element of bias to it because of what you've consumed and what you've lived, but putting that out there to support other people, it's their choice to take on board that and to experience that as a patient over the years that you've treated. And of course, the results that you've had with them will vindicate largely that, because you're speaking to them about lifestyle factors rather than, yes, take this pill. Well, have you actually ever thought about how often you're eating, what you're consuming, the quality of it, and what you actually allergic to? Because you may have significant levels of inflammation or reaction to some of these foods. So I find that very, very interesting. But intermittent fasting, one of the big questions for me is, there's so many different windows that are available. What are some of the ways that people can start as an entry point if we accept the premise that it can have a huge positive effect?
Yeah, no, and it's a fantastic question, and one that is commonly asked. I think if you're eating snacks in between meals, I would start there and say, eliminate the snacks, because you want to pull the Band-Aid. You can either pull the Band-Aid off fast, or you can do it slowly. And so I find most people need it to be pulled off slowly. So get rid of your snacks, which is then going to force you to restructure your meals. I am very much an animal-based protein advocate. I think that, there's no equivalency in plant-based proteins. Hopefully I'm not offending any of your listeners. You'll do it at the detriment at the amount of carbohydrates you consume. So animal-based protein, healthy fats, non-starchy vegetables, but you'll know that you've been able to structure your meals properly when you're not hungry in between. We're not designed to be eating every 2 to 3 hours. And so, you get plenty of muscle protein synthesis as one example, based on what you consume in a 24-hour period of time. And so that's usually where we start from. And then starting with a 12-hour fasting window, or really just digestive rest is what I call it, because it seems much more benign. But people don't understand that, physiologically, our bodies are, probably designed to have a meal maybe every 4 to 5 hours during the daytime. And so what people don't understand is that when you're eating with tremendous frequency, not only can your body not properly break down, assimilate, detoxify what you're eating, but you break down key mechanisms in digestion, like the migrating motor complex, or the MMC. They always say it acts like a street sweeper in your gut, moving things forward, helping with detoxification. But if you're eating too frequently, it completely knocks that out. So starting with 12 hours fasted, maybe you go from 6 o'clock at night till maybe you're going 13 hours, maybe you have breakfast at 7, and then initially aiming for 16 hours fasted. Now, a lot of people, depending on how fat adapted they are, if they're not already fat adapted, depending on how lean they are, and what their diet is like, they may get into fat adaptation or ketosis a whole lot faster. If someone's coming from a standard American diet and is a couch potato, it could take them 6 to 8 weeks to get to that point. But that's when the fun starts, when you get to a point where you're fat adapted and your body is able to flex back and forth between using carbs or fats as a fuel source. And that's ideally what we want. That's how our bodies are designed to thrive. So I always think that's a good starting point, is to aim for a 16-8, but understanding that that process may take a while. And I think there's this concept of comparisonitis, that everyone wants to see what everyone else is doing and emulate it. And I just remind people, we're all an N of one. We're all bio individuals. It's really helpful if you take the time to, if you really take the time to determine, investigate, experiment with what feels back, what resonates. I think men and postmenopausal women have the easiest time with fasting, whereas women that are still at like peak fertile years, or still cycling, every month, or women that are in perimenopause, which is the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause, gets a little bit more complicated, a little more nuanced. It's not insurmountable, but they really have to fast for their cycle. That's what I think is really, really important.
Yeah, well explained, Cynthia. And I think straight away advocating for the removal of snacking is something that anyone who has health at mind would throw their weight behind, because you've given some scientific evidence there of how the body deals with the food in your gut is stunted if you're eating really, really regularly. And straight away, snacks, we all know, are much less likely to be nutrient dense whole foods that our body reacts well to anyway. They're much more likely to be like hyper palatable, super high in sugar, whatever else. And that's not to necessarily demonize that. We can get onto that at some point. But it's very important that when you have these breaks between meals, your body actually deals with it much better. And I'm very much of the opinion that most of us in the Western world, a lot of the problems that we have come from abundance of access to hyperpalatable foods. Even those from poorer economic backgrounds actually have access to very cheap, hyperpalatable, high-calorie foods that are consumed regularly throughout the day. And I don't know if many people really know what hunger feels like, because they're constantly what I would call saturated. And I think when you encourage somebody to take an approach straight away to remove the snacks, and then this longer window overnight for starters and into the morning is very positive. Because when I think of maybe bad habits that you can have pre-bed for your sleep hygiene, it's actually having a very heavy meal close to sleep, because you don't give yourself the chance to digest it. So when you called out the 6 p.m. finish as an arbitrary number, of course, and then maybe eating again for breakfast, it is a lot easier to see that your quality of sleep would be a lot higher, and you're already starting to eat into that 16 hours that you potentially are trying to generate as that initial target for real success, to find yourself being fat adapted. So an exciting step-by-step process there, and one that I can certainly see the benefits of even as you make those small steps.
Well, and I agree with you. What you're really referring to is chronobiology. So really eating in alignment with our chronobiology, when, it's acknowledging that this is a good example. It's winter time, and we should really be eating when it's light outside and not eating when it's dark out. And that includes really not eating 2 to 3 hours before bedtime, because there are a series of hormones that are implicated in sleep. And one of them is this balance between melatonin and cortisol. And I remind people that melatonin is not just secreted in the brain. We actually have circadian clocks throughout our body, including our gut, which explains why if you eat a big meal and then try to go to bed and you have a terrible night of sleep, it's because you're putting your body at odds with what it's supposed to be doing. Am I supposed to be sleeping, or am I supposed to be digesting? And so you really, can set yourself up for, elevations in cortisol, which is going to suppress melatonin and is going to impact your blood sugar and insulin sensitivity. And so all of these things really play a role. But I think that I've come to find that the longer that I talk about this topic, the more nuanced it becomes, meaning that the more I understand about the body, and heck, I know a lot. The more I understand about the body, the more I feel like I don't understand so much about the body. Like the more you unpack about the digestive processes and sleep and the autonomic nervous system and the influence of the processed food industry, which, as you kind of alluded to, the food is designed to be as hyper palatable, nutrient devoid as possible. And what's of relevancy is that earlier this week, I connected with Dr. David Perlmutter, who just wrote a book called Drop Acid, which is absolutely brilliant. It's probably my favorite book he's written. And it talks a lot about, this other marker of metabolic health called uric acid. And so everyone that's listening should know their numbers, because it's not just about gout. There's really a drive in the body to make fructose on its own in response to blood sugar fluctuations in response to salt consumption. I'm not talking about sea salt. I'm talking about crappy processed iodized salt. Our body on its own can actually make fructose. And so it makes sense when you talk about this abundance. We have everything in abundance. It's this hedonistic environment. We can get anything that we want, any time of the day or night, whether it's on electronics or food. And that's not the way our bodies are designed to thrive. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that the concept of hunger scares people. They eat sometimes to suppress emotional hunger, physical hunger. It becomes hugely problematic. And I think that one thing that scares people initially about fasting is that they do get connected to what true intrinsic hunger feels like, and they haven't felt it in such a long time that they don't know what to do about it. And so this is also situations where I will see people that get into trouble because they fast way too long, and then their amygdala, which is their primitive brain, overrides their prefrontal cortex, and then they binge. And then they feel guilty that they binge because they fasted too long, and it becomes this vicious cycle. So there's so much psychology behind fasting and eating to surplus or excess, or under eating or undernourishing our bodies. And I think that it's a really interesting discussion about the messages we've been taught, not only as children, but even as young adults and adults, about food. And I tell people all the time, up until the age of like refrigeration, and certainly, the rise of the processed food industry after World War II, prior to that, people generally looked pretty healthy. They might have died of preventative things that we see from our perspective now, whether it's an infection or pneumonia, or from cancer, because the technology just hadn't evolved to a state that we could be more aggressive about it. But there was a lot of food scarcity. And because there was food scarcity, you didn't see a lot of obesity. And now what we see is a lot of obesity and metabolic health issues. And a great deal of it can be tied to what we eat and when we eat.
What are the common mistakes you see with fasting? You called out one there where maybe somebody fasts far too long and it causes them a chemical challenge within their mind, where they then go in a frenzy and then they get into this binge restrict cycle, which is the opposite of health. What are some other mistakes that people make when they try and get involved?
I would say, they either, so there's differentiators. Like some people don't know how to clean fast, meaning they consume bitter teas, coffee, or water. They dirty fast, meaning some fit pro on the internet's told them if they eat a handful of grapes, it doesn't count. Yes, it does. Fructose will break your fast really fast. So I think there's a differentiator between clean and dirty fasting. I think there is a differentiator between, and this is specific to women because men don't have menstrual cycles, but women that aren't fasting aligned with their menstrual cycles. So I talk a bit about this in the book, but really women should not be fast. If you're still in your peak fertile years and you're still getting a menstrual cycle, you have to be careful about honoring your unique physiology, which means you can't fast every day of the month. I see a lot of people that don't sleep well and they force fasting because they're desperate to lose weight. Sleep is absolutely foundational to our health. It's something that I'm always trying to hack, not because I'm trying to get less of it. I just want the best quality sleep I can get. And so I wear an Oura ring. I have all sorts of like biohacking things I love to use. I'm kind of a data nerd. And so, if you're not sleeping through the night, please don't add in fasting. That's like a standard moniker. People are like, I only sleep 5 hours a night, but I want to fast. I'm like, no, you can't. You have to work on the sleep piece first. I would say the other thing is people not understanding that what you break your fast with is important. And I realize not everyone's ready for like a big meal. I sit down and eat a big meal, but I also have the kind of lifestyle that I need to be able to eat a big meal because I may not have an opportunity to eat again for a while. And so you want to always make sure you're focused on protein, and either protein with carbs or protein with fat, but never carbs by themselves and never carbs and protein together. Never carbs and fat together, because you will just keep eating and eating and eating. Great example are things like cheese and nuts. Like people really struggle to keep those portions reasonable. So I think those are typically the more common things that I see. Obviously, there's lots of nuances. There are people that aren't in a position to be really aggressive with fasting, and they start out of the gate wanting to do 2-day, 3-day fasts and like time out, let's get the basics down. Or there are people that just compromise their fasting and they don't realize that. Those are usually the more common things that I see.
The entry to breaking your fast was very interesting for me there in terms of the combination of macronutrients that you're advocating for, because I know from when I've dieted to my leanest, when I've used maybe intermittent fasting to restrict my calorie consumption based on the window that I'm eating. When I open with protein and fats, I'm more satisfied for longer than if I have carbohydrates. And you mentioned there's some really high fat sources like cheese and nuts, which are very calorie dense, but very what I would call moreish in terms of you could eat and eat and eat those, and the kind of the response in your brain is very limited to Colin, you're full now, or Cynthia, you probably don't need any more of this, but you're like, not a problem, I can shovel this down. And then it takes a good while for us to actually recognize like satiety or a level of fullness. So I like that you advocate a really clear choice based on what you're going to do. So you were saying that if you were going to have a larger meal based on the rest of your schedule for the day, so say you break your fast for argument's sake at midday and you don't get to eat till 4, 5, 6 o'clock, whatever, then of course you have a larger meal. But that's because of the practice that you've had over the period, and of course the choices that you make. So I'd love to know, like, what does that meal often look like where you've got this longer period? What keeps you full, Cynthia, when it comes to eating?
Great question. I would say, and this is something people are always curious about. I mean, I try to eat my biggest meal of the day midday. I just do better. We know that we become less insulin sensitive as the day goes on. So if I'm going to have carbs, they're going to be at the middle of the day, not the end of the day. But common things like we have some bison burgers. I might have that with some type of cruciferous vegetable. So Brussels sprouts or asparagus is not a cruciferous vegetable, but like Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, sometimes asparagus. It depends. Like if my meat has fat in it, then I don't feel like I have to add extra fat. But if I were to have something like cod, which is kind of a pretty lean fish, I might have some avocado. I might have nuts on a salad that I have that with. But always focused on animal-based protein. And in my house, I have teenage boys, so we go through a lot of animal-based protein. But I would say favorites are like beef, pork, bison. We even do some wild boar. We've done elk. We like fish, salmon, tuna, cod, trout, shrimp, like shellfish here. I love eggs. I eat a lot of eggs. I mean, sometimes when there's, no other ideas out there, I'll have eggs and bacon. I always say I can have that any time of the day, and I really enjoy it. But I tend to cycle my carbohydrates. So I wouldn't describe my diet as ketogenic, but I'm definitely lower carbing it most days. And then I will have 1 or 2 days a week where I have higher carbohydrate intake, usually aligned with days I'm doing like maybe legs or doing, something a little more strenuous in the gym. That works for me. I've been carnivore. I did carnivore for 9 months after a long hospitalization and 2019. And I missed vegetables every step of the way, but I wasn't in a position because I'd been so sick to be able to tolerate anything with any fiber. So I think it's important for people to kind of experiment to see like what feels best to them. I just do better really pushing the protein. I aim for 100 grams of protein a day, which when I'm like 115 pounds, that's a lot. So I really push the protein envelope, sometimes to the point where I love that it completely sets off the satiety signal. So for me, I'm fully satiated when I've had enough protein, and that doesn't have to be the case. If I sat down with like a bowl of like squash or sweet potato, I would be like, I might start looking for more food to eat. So I think in a lot of instances, people need to understand how satiating protein is and really hitting your protein macros. I'm sure this is something you talk to your listeners about a lot. And I think most, if not all, people undereat protein. Maybe not the bodybuilding community, but I find most, if not all, adults don't eat enough. They eat way less, like maybe 25 to 30 grams per serving or per like meal, which is not nearly enough to trigger muscle protein synthesis. It's not enough to maintain muscle. You're not going to build muscle. And so I think that's really important. Exactly that.
And I think we've talked about windows. We've talked about some of the benefits from an insulin and a weight management perspective and a calorie perspective. We're speaking about some of the sources, but I'd love to hear from you about a brain perspective. So how does it support us when it comes to performance? Because you've just written a book. You're somebody that is articulate, eloquent, well-spoken, and you feel that's aided by your approach to your nutrition as well. And I'd love you to share how others can start to implement that too.
Yeah. And it's a great question. I think brain health, the more I learn about the brain, the more humbled I am by the brain. So at a very kind of basic level, we know that when we're able to utilize ketones as a fat source, as a fuel source, we can get diffusion of a specific type of ketone, beta hydroxybutyrate, across the blood-brain barrier. Our brains love fat. They love fat. It's a really efficient, clean use of fuel, so you'll get tremendous mental clarity. I think about with fasting that you can get upregulation in GABA production. This is this calming neurotransmitter. We know that there are even some specific types of fast that can impact dopamine. So dopamine is this pleasure principle neurotransmitter in the body that, unfortunately, with our kind of hedonistic lifestyle, sometimes gets dimmed. And so both I always say a social media and a traditional fast can help with resetting those dopamine surges. But what I think is most important about brain health as it pertains to fasting is it helps with insulin sensitivity. And whether people understand this or not, we have sex hormone programming in our brain, progesterone, estradiol, testosterone. And yes, men and women both have sex hormone physiology that occurs throughout the body. And so it's really important for people to understand that if you look at and I'm going to use as an example, like a traditional American male, we know that 88.2% of the US population is metabolically unhealthy. It's probably worse than that because that was data from 2018. So just to think from a perspective, if every male in the Western world had normal testosterone levels, that would be one thing. But what happens for a lot of males in particular is that they, with the degree of insulin resistance that many of them are not even aware of they will convert testosterone to estradiol. It's a process called aromatization. And so this has a negative net impact on brain health. We know that for women, as they're aging and they become less insulin sensitive, this impacts brain signaling as well. So one of the number one ways you can protect brain function is to keep your insulin levels sensitive, to keep your insulin levels proper. And I know what the values are within the United States, and I know that you all probably have a different way of measuring things, so I don't want to throw out numbers. But the point of what I make is if we want to avoid developing neurocognitive disorders that include things like Alzheimer's, vascular dementia, Parkinson's, et cetera, you have to keep your brain health as a priority. And that includes eating less frequently. And it also includes being mindful of the types of fats you consume. So, here in the United States, seed oils kind of proliferate in the processed food industry. And so I always encourage people to read labels because the things you want to avoid are inflammatory, rancid, crappy, industrial type oils like soybean, canola, sunflower, safflower, et cetera. And you want to consume heart healthy sources like walnuts and olive oils or olives. Nuts are hard to moderate. So I always say, ghee, clarified butter, grass-fed butter are great choices. If you tolerate the heavier fats like duck fat and tallow and lard, great. Some people don't. And then eating those high quality animal-based meats or fish for that matter. And then brightly pigmented vegetables. Like I tell people all the time, we want to really eat the rainbow, but in the pigmentation of the vegetables are a lot of phytonutrients and polyphenols that can be tremendously important for brain health. But that's like in a nutshell. But the more I understand about brain physiology, the more I appreciate and value insulin sensitivity because they really need to go hand in hand.
A huge part of that there, though, was around inflammation, wasn't it? Because you mentioned things like Alzheimer's and dementia, which are largely driven from the understanding that I have of it in terms of inflammatory conditions within the brain. And when you were talking about some of the food sources there, they are traditionally low inflammation foods, which support people with both their gut, but of course their brain. And we now know that, well, it's commonly said that the gut is the second brain, isn't it? So it's very, very important that the things that we consume support that. And some of those food sources that you advocated for are actively supporting that. So of course, the fasting period is allowing these areas of your body to repair and replenish with all the different molecules and different things that are going on. But ultimately, when we do eat, the things that we do choose to consume are very, very important, because in the fitness industry, you spoke about people tracking protein and stuff like that before, which is obviously a very good habit. But many people use IF for some disordered behaviors because they know that, oh, I can have this 1,200 calorie meal as my last meal because I'm on 2,000 a day and I've had 400 and 400. I can have this junk bowl of food that hits my calorie target, but best believe from a health perspective, they've completely missed the forest for the trees and have actually lost out on the true benefits of IF, which you're espousing.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I definitely want to touch on one thing that you stated, talking about inflammation, oxidative stress. and imagining like each cell inside of each one of our cells, we have something called the mitochondria, which is the powerhouses of the cells. And what we want to do is keep those healthy. And one of the ways that we do that is reducing inflammatory foods, reducing oxidative stress, some of the things that I've already alluded to. But I tell people all the time that you want to be mindful of your mitochondria. We know about 50% of people older than 40 have dysfunctional mitochondria. And there are plenty of people that have chronic diseases younger than 40 years of age that have mitochondrial dysfunction. So super, super important. I love that you brought up the calories piece. I am not a proponent of CECO, calories in, calories out, because it completely discounts the net impact of specific macronutrients in the body. And so macros are protein, fat, and carbs. Although I'm sure your audience already knows that, but sometimes when I use that terminology, people are like, what? I don't know what that means. And I think it's really important that we need to understand that food is information. And I am a huge proponent in understanding that most often hormonal dysregulation in the body is a byproduct of hormonal imbalance, which can be facilitated in one way or another by how frequently we eat, as well as the types of foods that we eat. And so when people abide or embrace by this kind of reductionistic methodology of calories in, calories out, it really misses the boat, because the example that you gave about the 1,200 calorie junk food fest is going to do far more damage to your body than you could ever imagine. I mean, just thinking about the blood sugar dysregulation, potentially if it's got estrogen mimicking chemicals in it. I just find a lot of the junk food that's out there really is junk, and our body doesn't know what to do with it. It may very well just store it as fat because it's trying to protect us from that. So I remind people that we really want to abide by a nutritional paradigm that's going to align itself with honoring our physiology, honoring the way that our hormones need to be balanced. And we want to insulin's not a bad hormone, but we want to ensure that we keep our blood sugar as stable as possible. So yes, in response to food, our blood sugar is going to go up. Insulin will be secreted. It'll move it back into the cells, but we don't want to be in a position where we're putting together foods that are making it harder for our body to, properly regulate itself. I mean, I wear a continuous glucose monitor throughout the year. I encourage most of my patients and clients to wear continuous glucose monitors or to have a glucometer so they can monitor what their blood sugar response is to a given meal or in response to stress or sleep. That can be incredibly insightful. So maybe that person that had that 1,200 calorie junk fest watched their blood sugar stay up for hours, which is doing far less benefit than they would imagine. And the concept of if it fits my macros really kind of, how do I politely say this? I think it misses the whole clinical picture of what you're doing to your body. Like you could be eating really well all week, and then you have a cheat day and you undo all of the benefit of the foods you've been eating, and maintaining a much healthier lifestyle. So I encourage people just to be, if they're going to be targeted, be smart about it.
Yeah, absolutely, Cynthia. And I think we've touched on a lot of the positive benefits in the entry level to intermittent fasting, but of course, upcoming is your life's work so far in terms of incorporated into a book. Where can people check that out if they're interested, Cynthia?
Yeah, so it's Intermittent Fasting Transformation, IF45. It's a 45-day plan. It is going to be published officially on March 15th, but there are pre-sales options right now, meaning that there are bonuses that'll be available prior to publication date that will not be available afterward. There's a masterclass. There are a couple additional programs, more recipes. There are over 50 recipes in the book, and they are very aligned with some of our discussion today. But you can get it on Amazon, Target, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore. And I have confirmed that you can purchase it outside the United States. There are links through my website that you can go to that will take you to your respective country so you can place an order.
Perfect, Cynthia. And beyond that, if people want to continue the conversation with you online, where should they head towards?
Yeah, I would say probably starting with my website. So it's my name, www.cynthiathurlow.com. I am very active on Instagram. I'm a little snarky on Twitter. I do have a free Facebook group called Intermittent Fasting Lifestyle / my name. And then I have an amazing podcast called Everyday Wellness, where I get to interview some of the most interesting characters in the health and wellness space. But those are good places to connect with me.
Fantastic, Cynthia. I'll link your website and where people can get the book in the show notes below. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I'm sure you, the listener, have as well. And I'll be back to speak to you all again very, very soon.